Welcome. I'm Erik Fleming, host of A Moment with Erik Fleming, the podcast of our time. I want to personally thank you for listening to the podcast. If you like what you're hearing, then I need you to do a few things. First, I need subscribers. I'm on Patreon at patreon.com/A Moment with Erik Fleming. Your subscription allows an independent podcaster like me the freedom to speak truth to power and to expand and improve the show. Second, leave a 5-star review for the podcast on the streaming service you listen to it. That will help the podcast tremendously. Third, go to the website, momenterik.com. There you can subscribe to the podcast, leave reviews and comments, listen to past episodes, and even learn a little bit about your host. Lastly, don't keep this a secret like it's your own personal guilty pleasure. Tell someone else about the podcast. Encourage others to listen to the podcast and share the podcast on your social media platforms because it is time to make this moment a movement. Thanks in advance for supporting the podcast of our time. I hope you enjoyed this episode as well.
The following program is hosted by the NVG Podcast Network.
Hello, and welcome to another Moment with Erik Fleming. I am your host, Erik Fleming. So, it is Black History Month, 2026, which is a special Black History Month as it is the 100th year of celebrating Black history in the United States of America. This was started by an organization with Carter G. Woodson and several others in Chicago to commemorate 50 years, at that time, 50 years of emancipation of African Americans or Black people from slavery. And that organization still exists, and we still exist. Black people. It started off as a week celebration, and it is now a full month. And there are people that criticize that, and I might get into that in my editorial at the end of the podcast, but I just wanted to acknowledge that and encourage you, especially if you're not Black, to pay attention. And I'll leave it at that. Got a couple of great guests, two young ladies who fit the theme of this podcast of having the fight. One is an author who is an award-winning author who has written a book about her experiences in life dealing with grief and tragedy and challenges. And it was a very, very compelling book. It brought me to tears, and I mentioned that in the interview to her directly. It's very rare. Well, I shouldn't say that anymore because the older I get, the more sensitive I get. So, this book took me there, but in a good way, right? And then the other sister is a lifelong nurse and educator who has been fighting the good fight when it comes to reproductive justice and health equity. And both of these ladies have exhibited taking the charge of fighting for what they believe in and what they're passionate about. And I think you will feel that in those interviews. So without any further delay, let's go ahead and get this show started. As always, you can support this show by going to www.momenterik.com. You can subscribe to the podcast. You can listen to past episodes. You can learn a little bit about me, a whole spiel you heard as the podcast got started, But in times like these, whatever you can do to support independent podcasts like this one is greatly appreciated. All right. It's time to kick it off. And as always, we kick it off with a moment of news with Grace G.
Thanks, Erik. The Justice Department confirmed that the massive release of over 3 million pages concludes the administration's planned disclosures regarding the Epstein files. Bill and Hillary Clinton have agreed to testify in a congressional probe into Jeffrey Epstein. The U.S. Supreme Court has cleared California to use a new electoral map expected to grant Democrats 5 additional House seats. Democrat Christian Menefee won a special election in Texas, further narrowing the Republican Party's slim majority in the U.S. House of Representatives. President Trump has nominated Kevin Warsh to lead the Federal Reserve. A federal judge denied a request from Minnesota officials to halt federal immigration operations. 5-year-old Liam Ramos and his father were released from an ICE facility after a judge ordered their return to Minnesota. President Trump announced that DHS agents should only intervene in city protests if specifically requested by local leaders or federal property is under direct threat. DHS Secretary Kristi Noem ordered the immediate deployment of body cameras for federal officers in Minneapolis. Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson issued an executive order requiring city police to investigate and potentially refer federal immigration agents for prosecution regarding alleged illegal activities. Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard defended her presence at an FBI raid on a Georgia election facility, claiming she was acting under the president's authority. A federal judge has dismissed federal murder and weapons charges against Luigi Mangione, the accused killer of United Healthcare CEO. A federal appeals court has dismissed a misconduct complaint filed by the Justice Department against a federal judge who had clashed with the administration over deportation policies. President Trump plans to close the Kennedy Center on July 4th for 2 years of reconstruction. And South Carolina's measles outbreak has reached 876 cases. I am Grace G, and this has been a Moment of News.
All right. Thank you, Grace, for that moment of news. And now it is time for my guest, Kelly Cervantes. Kelly Cervantes is an award-winning writer, speaker, and advocate best known for her blog Inchstones and her USA Today best-selling book Normal Broken, the grief companion for when it's time to heal, but you're not sure you want to. She has been published in the Chicago Tribune, Cosmopolitan, and Fortune, as well as featured by MSNBC, New York Times, and CNN. She sits on the boards of Cure Epilepsy and the Undiagnosed Diseases Network Foundation and hosts Cure Epilepsy's podcast, Seizing Life. Born and raised in the Midwest, Kelly now resides in Maplewood, New Jersey with her family. Her new book is The Luckiest, a memoir of life, of love, loss, and motherhood, and the pursuit of self. And we're going to be diving into that new book during the interview. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor and privilege to have as a guest on this podcast, Kelly Cervantes. All right. Kelly Cervantes, how you doing, ma'am? You doing good?
I am doing well, Erik. Thank you for having me.
Well, I'm honored to have you. It's not often that I get an author to come on that makes me cry. And, you know, I told Lissa, shout out to Lissa Warren, who set this up, you know, she tries to get me people that deal with nonfiction, and she knows this is a political show. And, you know, it's just like the stories that I've been very fortunate to get from her and being able to read the books. It's really been an honor and a treat. But I never had a book that really hit a chord with me like your book did. And I have to say that, you know, because The book is called The Luckiest, and it's been out for a while, but I wanted to talk about that. And since it's a political show, I'll dive into some political stuff. It won't be too heavy, but I think you'll have some input in that.
Yeah.
But I really wanted you to come on to talk about your story. So how I normally do this thing is that I have a couple of icebreakers. The first one is a quote, and then the second one is a game, I guess, or a challenge called 20 questions. So let's do the quote first. You know shit is bad when people start telling you how strong you are.
That quote means to me that, God, I live that on the daily. I think people, so funny. I was actually talking to a friend about this, that I think people, when they tell you, oh my goodness, you're so strong, or your kid is so strong, or they think it's a compliment. But I think what the person hears is, wow, your life is really shitty, or, thanks for this compliment of being so strong, but I didn't choose this. I don't know that I had a choice in the matter. It's one of those well-intentioned compliments that people give when they don't know what else to say. And I think over time, it doesn't mean what people think it means.
I got you. All right. So now with the 20 questions, I need you to give me a number between 1 and 20.
11.
All right. Where do you go to check a fact that you see, hear, or read?
Ooh, I go to NPR. I go to the New York Times. I go to Google. But when I go to Google, I'm usually checking 2 or 3 websites, 2 or 3 different pages to try and make sure that what I'm reading is accurate.
Okay. What led you to write this book?
I think, like many authors, this book needed to be I don't I don't know that I had a choice. I think it had to come out of me. And actually, there have been several versions. I have rewritten this book several times over. And the first version of this book was written, actually, I thought that it was written for public consumption, but it wasn't. That book was written for me. After my daughter Adelaide passed away, I was terrified of forgetting pieces of her. And I know that people will say that, well, she's your daughter, you could never forget, but you do. No matter what, time is a memory thief and memories fade. And I was so terrified that I sat down and I wrote essentially the story of her life through my eyes. And that was part of my healing journey, because I believe that one of the best ways for us to heal through our losses is to remember them. Actually, President Joe Biden, regardless of how you feel about his politics, is a man who knows loss. He lost his infant daughter and a wife in a car accident, and then a grown son, right, to breast cancer or to brain cancer. And so he said the night before he was inaugurated that he was giving a COVID-19 memorial. He was leading over it. And he said, to heal, we must remember. And those words struck me so much, because up to that point, I had thought that healing meant that we had to let go and move on. And here was a man who had lost so much, and he was saying, no, to heal, we must remember. We remember our loved ones. We remember everything about them. And then we learn how to move forward with their memory. And that to me was so pivotal. And so that was sort of the first iteration of the book. It was me healing through remembering. And then as time went on, I realized that instead of telling my daughter's story, I wanted to tell my story, because I look at my life and I could break it down into so many different places, so many different ways, from the different places that I've lived, the Midwest, the East Coast, back to the Midwest, times and, little blips in LA. Or I could break it down to the different careers I've had. I am 43 years old and I am on my 4th career, and they are all vastly different. You wouldn't think that they overlap, but that's the interesting pieces, that they all do. Or I could break it down to the different makeups of what my family has looked like. And I came across a quote from the poet Maggie Smith, and she said, "We are all nesting dolls carrying the previous versions of ourselves inside of us." And that struck me as so poignant and so true as I looked at this different makeup of my life. And so I used that quote as the structure to look at my life and all of these different layers, and whether they were gut-wrenching or joyous or whatever they added to me, whatever this layer added, I don't get to be the person that I am today without all of those layers before. And the fact of the matter is that I'm pretty proud of the person that I am today. And the life that I have right now is actually really beautiful. And there's 100 things I wish I could change, not least of which is that my daughter was still alive. But I don't get this life. I don't get to be who I am without experiencing all of that. And I wanted to get that point across to people that no matter what you have experienced in your life, no matter where you are currently, we are constantly growing. We are constantly adding new layers and becoming this next beautifully painted doll in the series of our lives.
Yeah. And that's such a great answer, because that was, you put the other two quotes I was debating about using in that answer. How has your early acceptance of being different shaped your life?
Yeah. So I grew up in very conservative white Midwest. And because my parents were not from, I grew up in Nebraska. My parents weren't from Nebraska. They had transferred there for my dad's job. So we would travel around the country to see family. And getting in our, 1992 Chevy minivan and driving across the country to Philadelphia and up to Maine, and everything was road trips. And so we got to see so much of the country. And I realized standing in New York that there were whole swaths of this country that weren't like where I was growing up. And I never felt like I fit in, and in Nebraska. And I think that a lot of kids feel that way. But I write in the book that it wasn't just that I felt different. I also felt like I needed to be different. Like I needed to push back against these norms, that I didn't want to be a part of the status quo. And I think that part of that is because I knew there was this wider world out there, that there were all of these other cultures, that there was so much more than this tiny microcosm of a culture that I was experiencing. And I wanted to see that, and I wanted to experience it. And so the first opportunity I had when I turned 18 and was looking at colleges, I looked at both coasts, because I wanted to go somewhere where everyone was different, where I wasn't just the one that felt different in this whitewashed society. I wanted to be among a ton of people who were all different, who were, come from different religions and different cultures and different racial backgrounds. And so that I could experience and learn from that. And we don't learn from people who are the same as us. We learn from people who are different from us.
Yeah. So what does the book's title mean to you?
The Luckiest. I think that it's certainly ironic, right? I don't think that many people would read the book and look at my life or look at anyone who has lost a child and be like, that person is the luckiest. And I don't think that I am. But I also don't believe that I'm the unluckiest. Luck is a concept that I have battled and struggled and thought over for years, because even as a child, I was very aware that my upbringing was safe. It was sheltered. My parents were married. They loved each other. I never went without. Many people would look at my childhood and think that it was lucky. And I acknowledge that, and I own that. But then you look at a lot of my adulthood and it runs in contrast to that because of decisions that I made to go into places that were not as safe and to make decisions that aren't as safe, but that are more exciting and interesting and that I would learn from. We learn from challenge. We learn from not taking the safe road. And so when do we correlate lucky with safe, with not taking risk? And I really enjoyed writing about that and looking at the ways that luck shows up in my life, or the perception of luck, right? Because luck is all about perception. It's what we show other people about our lives, be it through Instagram squares, or it is what people perceive of us. There's a scene in the book where my husband played Alexander Hamilton in the Chicago and Broadway productions for close to 8 years. And Broadway has just reopened after the pandemic, and Miguel is on stage, and I'm sitting next to this young woman who is a musical theater student, and she's like, oh my goodness, she realizes that Miguel is my husband, and she's like, you are so lucky. This life, and she sees my life as lucky, and all I can think in my head is, my daughter died 1.5 years ago. There's nothing lucky about my life, but what she was seeing, what she was able to perceive was lucky. At the end of the day, I am not the luckiest, but there are certain aspects of my life where I do consider myself incredibly lucky. And one of those is to have been the mother to all of my children, but especially to Adelaide, my daughter who passed away because and I know that maybe sounds crazy, because what we experienced and what we went through and all of the pain and all of the heartache, but I learned more through the 4 years of being her mother than I have through the other decades of my life. And I feel so fortunate that I got to know her and that I got to love her. And I feel sorry for people who didn't. And there is just something I will never have a job in my life that is more fulfilling than having been her mother. And for that, I absolutely feel like I'm the luckiest person in the world.
Let's dig into that a little more. Explain the significance of the parable of the farmer and the horse.
Yes. Funny. So I had I've loved this parable for a long time. And then anyone who has a young child that has watched Bluey will have also become familiar with this old Chinese parable. But it's this idea that, so a farmer loses he purchases a horse and it runs off. And his neighbor says, oh my goodness, that is so unlucky that this horse ran off. And the farmer says, well, maybe, let's see. And then the horse comes back and it brings with it another horse with it. And the neighbor is like, oh my goodness, how lucky. And the farmer says, well, we'll see. And then his son gets on the horse that the other horse brought back, and he breaks his leg on this horse. And the farmer is like, oh my goodness, that's so unlucky. And then there's a draft for all of the young men to go fight in a war. And the farmer's son can't go because of his broken leg. And the neighbor is like, oh my goodness, how lucky. And so this idea that you have no idea what's around the corner. So I see that in my careers. I was an actress for the first 5 years. I was in New York City, and it was grueling and it was hard, and it did so much damage to my mental health, to the point where eventually, when I met my husband and we decided to start a family, I chose to walk away from that and had the opportunity to work in restaurants. And, at the time I thought, how unlucky that I didn't get to make it big, that I wasn't sitting across from David Letterman or Jay Leno being able to talk about my next movie. But then I go into restaurants and I realize that all of that experience of performing and listening as an actor translates very well to selling events for the event space in this restaurant. My father was like, oh, thank goodness you're finally using your communications degree in restaurants. And I was like, no, Dad, it's all of the acting classes I paid for that I'm actually using in sales to connect and to sell these events. And so when you hear that parable parable, and you can look at your life and see how everything in that moment may seem unfortunate, but there's something else coming around the bend. You are going to need those skills. You are going to need that transition. And as I have just dove in headfirst into the world of grief, I've realized that so much of grief is actually resistance to change. We are resisting the change that our loss is inflicting upon our lives. And so in addition to this idea of to heal, we must remember, we also have to learn how to accept our new normals, how to accept the change that has happened in our lives. And all of that is part of that healing process and the ability to move forward.
Yeah. What is the line, asteroids I learned are not fairly rationed, mean?
So in my naivety, my husband and I, after my son Jackson was born, we got pregnant again with another little boy. It was discovered at his 20-week ultrasound that he was not going to survive. He had essentially he had no heart. His lungs were, or his heart was taking up his entire chest cavity, and he had no lungs. And he was never going to survive outside of my womb. And we made the excruciating choice to terminate. And I thought that was my life's trauma, that this was the asteroid, and now everything else was going to be okay. I mean, looking back on that now and those thoughts going through my head, it's just like, it sounds crazy and so privileged and just so incredibly naive. But I really thought that. I thought that this was my life's moment, my life's tragedy. And because of that, when my daughter started to not meet milestones and started having trouble, I lived in denial because she had to be healthy. She had to be okay because our son Elvis wasn't. And as her health continued to deteriorate, I realized that those asteroids, these flaming rocks that crash into the landscape of our lives, that completely alter the way that it looks. And you have to now navigate this new terrain, that these asteroids are not fairly rationed. And there are certain people who are going to experience dozens of asteroids in their lifetime. And there are some people who may only have one or two, and maybe that's luck. maybe that's the true luck is the less asteroids you have. But then again, I don't know, because I think you become a stronger, more interesting, more compassionate person the more asteroids that you survive.
Yeah. So talk about the work that you're doing with Cure Epilepsy.
Yes. So in terms of the political nature of your show, I truly believe that everything in life is politics. I don't think that we get to separate the two out. And I experienced that with my son Elvis, and how fortunate I was that I was able to make the choice that I was in the state that I lived in. And I understand that's not the choice that everyone would make, but it's the choice that my husband and I made with our doctors. And I'm so grateful that that was a choice. And so I started advocating for a woman's right to choose after that. And then come to my daughter having her first seizure and being diagnosed with epilepsy, and going to the doctor and having them just not be able to tell me why she was having seizures or what medication was going to control them or how they could stop them. And I had always lived in this world where I thought that like modern medicine was so evolved that we had all of these answers. And now I was in the world of neurology. There are so few answers. There's so many more questions than there are answers. And it was excruciatingly frustrating. Around the same time that Adelaide was diagnosed with epilepsy, Miguel landed Hamilton, and our family moved from New Jersey to Chicago for the show. And it just so happens that there was this organization in Chicago called Cure Epilepsy. It was started by another mom, Susan Axelrod, married to the political professional guru, David Axelrod of the Obama administration. And she was frustrated with everyone talking about how to live well with epilepsy. And she wanted the community to start thinking about how to cure epilepsy. And she started this organization that is now in its third decade and has raised so much money for epilepsy research and trying to find the whys behind it all, trying to find cures, trying to push science forward. And, science didn't catch up to my daughter, but this is an I am so incredibly passionate about the importance of research, medical research, especially. And as we look at the current administration and the cuts and the slashes to research, both, at the NIH and across the board with the university research as well. It's terrifying to me because this is going to have implications beyond just epilepsy research. We are actually witnessing a brain drain of professors and researchers leaving the United States to go overseas where their research can be funded. And so it's one of the reasons I'm incredibly proud to be a part of Cure Epilepsy. I sit on their board and I host a podcast for them called Seizing Life, because the organization is working right now actually through a campaign to raise money to try and help fill these holes in some of these researchers' labs so that we can keep them stateside, so that we can keep this research going. And I witnessed it, the difference in care firsthand last year. I was diagnosed with breast cancer and I'm fine now. I am cancer-free. But what a miracle of medical research that is, because I was diagnosed in January of 2025 and I was cancer-free by September of 2025. And that is due to breast cancer being one of the most well-researched diseases in the world. That is because hundreds of thousands of women have walked and raised money. And I got to go into a doctor's office and they said, this is the kind of cancer you have. This is how we're going to treat it. This is the prognosis and this is the timeline. And that is because of medical research. And so I am grateful to be sitting here with my life cancer-free on the other side of this in less than 1 year. And that is my goal it should be the goal across the board.
All right. Since you brought up politics, based on your experiences, what public policy changes would you like to see with adoption and healthcare?
Oh.
Because, I'm trying to be sensitive on time, and I know that later on in the book, you become an adoptive parent.
Yeah.
And you talk about the not so much the challenge, but the legal challenge, but the mental aspect.
Mm-hmm.
And that scene where you got the adults are at the top of the conference table discussing the terms and the kids are under the table playing. I was like, wow, that is, that sounds straight out of a movie, but it's but that's a reality that people face. So, and I kind of have a soft spot with adoption because I served on a board dealing with adoption in Mississippi for almost a decade. And I actually got to be chair for a minute. So that's an issue that's very, very sensitive to me. So what would you advocate for as far as policy changes with adoption and healthcare?
In regards to adoption, I think it's just so misunderstood. I think that there needs to be a whole public awareness campaign almost to understand that adoption is it is a beautiful thing. There is no question about it that it can be this beautiful thing, but that beautiful thing is born out of a family that has broken apart. And we have to understand that there is zero adoption that doesn't contain trauma. Even if it is, from infancy, there is still trauma that is going to be associated with that. And I look at my daughter's case and I am so grateful that I get to be her mother. I love her immensely, but it is impossible for me not to see that had her mother had the resources that she needed, that that family couldn't have been kept together. And it is, I think that so much of adoption policy exists way before adoption or child protective services ever become a part of the conversation, far before foster care is involved, far before the courts are involved. If we can support young mothers who are falling below the poverty line, if we can support these women in the way with childcare, with proper health care, then there will be less need for foster care services, for adoption. We can support those families and keep them together. And that is where I would love to see so much more energy be placed than in the family court systems. And, not to say that children shouldn't be adopted, but the system is broken.
Yeah. So talk a little bit about healthcare, because there's a scene. Well, I was going to say a scene, but there's this one particular moment where you're trying to get medication for Adelaide, and you got to go through all of these hoops and all the the way that you talk about it, as far as like, you were feeling guilty because you had some privilege, so you wanted to take advantage of it, but it's like you were cognizant of the fact, I don't know if it was afterthought or during, when you talk about people don't have that privilege to even take this first step that I'm doing, and then you find out you got another hope. So how would you deal with that at a healthcare standpoint?
I mean, our entire healthcare system needs to be overhauled, in my opinion. I do not think that any aspect of our healthcare system should be a publicly traded commodity. Everything should, like that piece of it alone is like shocking to me, that there are shareholders involved in people's healths, and it, like it is bonkers to me. In this particular scenario, and I think my daughter needed a medication, and the health insurance company decided that, who is not a doctor, her health insurance company decided that she did not need the medication. Her seizures had gotten so bad at this point. I mean, they were excruciating to watch. Her life was in danger. She had no quality of life. They were terrible. But the health insurance, we had gone through all of these different medications, and the health insurance company said, no, we're not going to pay for this medication. Why don't you try one of these other medications that we had already tried? The health insurance company didn't want to pay for that medication because it was, the treatment was going to be several $100,000. I get why they didn't want to pay for it. It was ludicrously expensive for a medicine that has been around for nearly 100 years. Like, it's stupid. But the pharmaceutical companies are allowed to charge that. And so, because they have shareholders that they have to report to. The health insurance companies have shareholders that they have to report to. And so we're in a battle between the health insurance company and the pharmaceutical company. And I happen to have a connection to the pharmaceutical company because of my work with Cure Epilepsy. Meanwhile, Adelaide's doctor is fighting with the health insurance company, and he has hundreds of other patients. Like, he doesn't have the time to be arguing as one of the top pediatric neurologists in the country, if not the world, with a health insurance company. And over again, I had to use our connections that we had through being advocates, which was only because my husband was Hamilton, which, we had, in the end, I'm threatening the pharmaceutical company to take our story public if they don't give us this medication. And after we have already gone through all of these hoops, and it's been nearly a week now that we're fighting for this medication. She's been having these terrible seizures, and it took everything, every piece of my consciousness and my soul. And I was wildly aware through the whole thing that not only were we at this distinct advantage because I had direct access to these people, But we had money. I spoke English as a first language. All of these things that allowed me an advantage. And it wasn't just getting medications, it was getting doctor's appointments. It wasn't even that. It was getting the respect from the doctors in the room because I didn't have to, because I knew English, because my skin is white, all of these things that just automatically, they're this cognitive bias that I'm going to be listened to. And then I learned quickly that if I spoke the doctor's language, if I said secretions instead of drool, if these little changes in my vocabulary, if I talked the way that the doctors talked, then they respected me that much more and listened to me. And it just happened over and over and over again, these glaring signs of the privilege that I had. And it is, I feel and worry so much about all of these other families out there that can't get the appointment, who aren't listened to in the doctor's office. And I don't know how we fix that without a complete and total overhaul of our healthcare system.
So, got a couple more questions I need to ask you. What does it mean to have the fight?
So I incredibly lucky, I'll say it, to have a dear friend of mine from high school. She unfortunately has a rare disease, and her mother had it too, and her mother passed away from it the same week that Adelaide was hospitalized with her first seizure. And I was close with her mother. Courtney continues to be one of my best friends in the world. I had no experience with the American healthcare system, really, outside of like giving birth and having to go to the doctor's office for flu shots or whatever. I was very inexperienced. And so when Adelaide is now in and out of the hospital, and I'm trying to navigate all of her different doctors with these different specialties, and I was so overwhelmed. And Courtney told me, that was actually her mother, in an email that she sent me just days before she died. She was in the hospital. She was sick. Days before she died, Courtney's mother sent me an email, and she essentially said that you know your daughter best. And if the doctors are saying something that you don't agree with, have the fight. And it means to me to trust your instinct. My aunt, she told me, she was like, there's a reason that they say that doctors are practicing medicine. Medicine is a practice. They are constantly learning. They are constantly growing. They do not know everything. And not to say that I know more than someone with an MD or a DO or a PhD, but I know my body best. And out of anyone, I knew my daughter best. And so we have to have the fight. We have to advocate for them. And if something doesn't feel right, if it doesn't sit right, ask the questions. Stand up. And if that doctor isn't answering them, find another doctor. I am a huge proponent of second, third, fourth opinions. I am still friends with with Adelaide's neurologist from Chicago. We're still dear friends. But even though I respected him and he was amazing, I still took her for second, third, fourth opinions to doctors across the country, because maybe someone else had seen something that he hadn't. Maybe they had read something that he hadn't. And it wasn't out of disrespect for him. It was because I wanted what was best for my daughter. And the right doctors will understand that. And so have the fight means compile the best team. It means ask all of the questions. It means advocate for yourself and for others.
Yeah, we don't have the time, but I went through a similar experience with my child. Well, I grew up with asthma, and it was a weird kind of asthma, like a childhood asthma. It's like once you hit puberty, it's like it goes away. I still don't know much about that, but
my brother had the same. I have asthma and I'm still asthmatic, but my brother's went away.
Yeah. And so, my child was going through the same thing, and the doctor kept trying to say, oh, well, it's just bronchitis and all that stuff. And I guess I had to fight, because I knew from the moment my child was born, that it was like I could hear the wheezing, right?
Yeah.
So I knew, and I just kept dealing with it, and finally I got a doctor, and, the rest is history, and turned out to be an astounding young human being. But so I can relate to that. But let me go ahead and close it out with these last two questions. What do you want readers to take away from this book?
I want them to take away that there is not one coming of age. That I think we so often we think of coming of age as like when we're teenagers, and then we grow into our adult selves, and then we are ourselves. And thank God I am not the same person that I was when I was 22. We are constantly growing. We are constantly coming of age. And how lucky are we to be able to do that, to continue to grow and change and acknowledge mistakes and to learn from them.
Yeah. So this is a question I'm closing out with every guest this year. Finish this sentence. I have hope because.
I have hope because to not have hope is to admit defeat. To me, hope is an action. The act of having hope is in and of itself. It's so much more than like wishing. It is, we take the steps toward hope. We do the actions that create the hope and even if whatever we are hoping for doesn't come to fruition, all of those steps along the way were part of it. And we can't give up. We can't give in. And that's hope. Hope is defiance.
Yeah. All right. So Kelly Cervantes, how can people get this book, The Luckiest?
The Luckiest is available everywhere books are sold, bookshop.org, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, or you can go to your local bookstore and ask them to order it if they don't already have it. Support the local bookstores.
So if people want to get more involved with Cure Epilepsy or just want to reach out to you, how can they do that?
Yeah, cureepilepsy.org. And I am on Facebook and Instagram. You just search up Kelly Cervantes, and also my website, kellycervantes.com. And I'm also on Substack, where I do a weekly newsletter about all things grief, love, life, loss. And I delve into politics and current events, currently on that theme, as I feel like many of us are.
Well, Kelly, thank you so much for coming on. I greatly appreciate it. Like I said earlier, that the book moved me and it reassured me, that no matter what challenges you face, you can fight through it. And that's why I really like that email that your friend's mom sent you about having to fight, because I think now more than ever, we have to have that. So thank you for sharing. And thank you again for coming on the podcast.
Thank you.
All right, guys. And we're going to catch y'all on the other side. All right. And we are back. And so now it is time for my next guest, Dr. Monica McLemore. Dr. Monica R. McLemore is a visiting professor at the Rory Myers College of Nursing at New York University. Prior to this, she was a tenured full professor in the Child, Family, and Population Health Department and the director for the Manning Price Bratlin Center for Anti-Racism and Equity in Nursing at the University of Washington School of Nursing. She previously held the endowed professorship and lecture in health promotions. Throughout 2023, she served as the interim associate dean for equity, diversity, and inclusion in the School of Nursing. She retired from clinical practice as a public health and staff nurse after a 28-year clinical nursing career in 2019. However, continues to provide flu and COVID-19 vaccines. Her program of research is focused on understanding reproductive health and justice. To date, she has 145 peer-reviewed articles, op-eds, and commentaries And her research has been cited in the Huffington Post, Lavender Health, 8 amicus briefs to the Supreme Court of the United States, and 4 National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine reports, and a data visualization project entitled How to Fix Maternal Mortality. The first step is to stop blaming women, that was published in the 2019 Future of Medicine edition of Scientific American. Her work has also appeared in publications such as Dame Magazine, Politico, ProPublica, NPR, and she's made a voice appearance in Terrence Nance's HBO series Random Acts of Flyness. She is the recipient of numerous awards and is a past chair for Sexual and Reproductive Health section of the American Public Health Association. She was inducted as a fellow of the American Academy of Nursing in 2019. She became the editor-in-chief of Health Equity Journal in 2022. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor and privilege to have as a guest on this podcast, Dr. Monica McLemore. All right. Dr. Monica McLemore.
McLemore.
McLemore?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing good. Glad to have you on. I'm really, really honored that you accepted my invitation. And I want to get into a subject that, has been really, really important to me and my background. I was a state legislator in Mississippi. And one of our big issues was maternal mortality and just health in general. And so since I have this platform, I've been trying to highlight that, and we'll get into the discussion. As a matter of fact, let's go ahead and do the icebreakers. So the first icebreaker is a quote I want you to respond to. If we continue to have a maternal health crisis, we continue to have an infant mortality crisis, then we're going to potentially see a situation or circumstance where Black people can be extinct in the future. And as long as I am around and a whole lot of other people are, we're not going to allow that. What does that quote mean to you?
That quote is from me at the STAT meeting year before last. I was on a panel with Harlan Krumholz, who is a public health researcher, physician colleague from Yale. And he has done some of the most preeminent studies. One was highlighted in the New York Times about premature Black death and looking at life expectancy over time to be able to appreciate and understand that there is preventable premature Black death from, everything from diabetes, hypertension, maternal morbidity, mortality, infant mortality. And we were talking about what could and should be done about it. I mean, I have to tell you, I was born in preemie in 1969, and our statistics around maternal and infant mortality have not changed in 100 years. And these are preventable deaths. And so, in my opinion, I worry that with the few number of people who are having children, period, to the number of moms and babies we lose every year, that, we have to do something if we want to continue to see Black people in the future. And we have to do things to ensure that we can be successful and be able to have the longevity, in my opinion, that we deserve. So, for me, I take very seriously this notion of having a dignified life and a dignified death. And it's not just because I'm a registered nurse. I should not be here. Prematurity is the number one killer, the number one cause of infant mortality around the world. 1 in 9 babies will be born prematurely. And we know that prematurity is preventable. But clearly we are making decisions to live in a country and a world that does not want to prioritize prevention. So as long as our public health infrastructure, which has been gutted by the current administration, and as long as our clinical enterprise continues to be starved of the essential resources that they need in order to be able to provide comprehensive preventative health care, the Medicaid cuts are just one version of that, then we will continue to see premature death from all-cause mortality. But it will be particularly exacerbated in Black and Brown and Native Indigenous people. And that's a decision we can make now to change, because people seem to have forgotten that every decision you make in the now changes the future. So that's how I think about it.
All right. So now the next icebreaker is what we call 20 questions. So I need you to give me a number between 1 and 20.
15.
When you think about the challenges our country faces, what gives you hope?
What gives me hope? That the dark times that we are currently experiencing are temporary. I tell my students this all the time, right? That night is not forever, and that decisions can't be made out of fear, because you will be ill prepared when that temporary darkness is over. So the way that I think about our current country, right? I mean, what was it last night? We had a sitting president post one of the most racist memes I've ever seen in my life about our former and first Black president and his family. And nobody said anything. Like, that's just okay. And when I think about that, I decided not to share it across my multiple social media platforms, because I feel very strongly that weathering is real. And weathering is a construct that Dr. Arlene Geronimus conceptualized in the early 80s and the 90s. And yes, she is still alive. And yes, she is a University of Michigan professor. And yes, she is a white woman. But she conceptualized this notion that constant assaults really trigger your nervous system, and it contributes to premature aging. And she has shown that, premature disposition for illness and death. And she has shown in Black people that when your, axis of your autonomic nervous system is constantly being assaulted, you don't recoil as quickly. And for Black and Brown people, that includes everything from interpersonal and structural racism as a factor that contributes to their premature aging, even at a cellular level, not just at a social one. So for me, what gives me joy, the notion of knowing that I want to be with incredible people who are visioning around what our future could look like. There are a lot of scientists, there are a lot of clinicians, there are a lot of people who want to rebuild and restore what has been lost by executive order. And that work is really important, but it's insufficient and it's not good enough, because I don't think we should build back better. I think we should build back different. And so for me, I am working with a lot of the early career people, the young folks who really are thinking about this in a really different way and trying to support and guide them to be able to have the resources that they need in order to remake all of this, where more people are supported and can win. So the temporariness of all of this is what gives me joy, not wallowing in the sadness that a lot of people feel about what's been lost. People ask me all the time, are you mad about the equity, diversity, inclusion, and all this other stuff? I was like, we made that. We can remake something else. The one thing that I need people to remember is racism can be outsmarted, even though it morphs to its time, and over time it's changed and it's been, institutionalized and structuralized in different ways. And we're still here. So as far as I'm concerned, am I frustrated and upset and sad and grumpy because I know it didn't have to be like this? Sure. But is that stopping me from putting things into place that will allow for people to do good work in the future? Hell no. Because I don't see that kind of ground. That's not really how I think about things. I'm not an inherently optimistic person, but I'm also a realist. And I'm going to do everything in my power to support folks who are thinking about this differently and who will reject the false premise that this is the status quo from now on. Not true. That's a lie. So that's what I think about it.
All right. So why are reproductive health and health equity among the most urgent issues in the U.S. today?
This is the way I explain it to people. So I'm a reproductive justice informed scientist, and reproductive justice was conceptualized by Black women. I don't know, 32 years ago. We just had our anniversary of 30 years of reproductive justice at a big party in Washington, D.C., like 2 years ago. And reproductive justice states simply that you have a human right to have children, to not have children, and to parent the children that you have in safe and healthy environments. And I like to add in the fourth tenet, which is you also have a human right to disassociate sex from reproduction, because that allows us to have adult conversations about healthy sexuality and consent as being part of a whole human life. So in my mind, the reason that reproductive health rights and justice are fundamental to everything we do is because if you can't safely propagate the human species, then all of us will be extinct. Reproductive justice is not just about organs, right? It's not just about uteruses and penises and ovaries and all. So it's actually the reproductive justice of ideas and opportunities. It's not just about propagating humans. So in my mind, the word reproduction, it draws everybody to, like, pregnancy and childbirth and all the things, but that's the end result isn't always human. Sometimes it's an idea. Sometimes it's an opportunity. So we need to widen our aperture in terms of how we think about what we want the future to look like. But the future is inextricably tied to the people that's going to be there or not. So I always say I'm a childless by choice cat lady, right? But the way that I think about it is somebody else's children is going to build the tech that I will use. Some of their people's children are going to be the physicians and the nurses and the social worker and all the people that's going to take care of me when I'm an old girl. Somebody else's tech is going to allow for us, or somebody else's children is going to allow for us to have beautiful art and movies and all these other things. So I don't get to abdicate my responsibility to shape the future because I have no personal stake in it. That's where everybody gets confused. So they make it very much about this sort of very individualized familial unit. And I try to get students to public, the people that we serve, that investments in the future actually should benefit everybody, whether you're going to be there or not. So you can't do that without thinking about what are we going to reproduce from this current era outside of humans. I mean, yeah, the human piece is important, but that shapes everything. If people existentially cannot govern and have bodily autonomy and community autonomy and data autonomy, then you're limiting what's possible in the future. And I don't want to live in a world that's like that. This is one of the reasons why I'm one of the biggest AI haters on the planet, even though I'm an early adopter to technology. I don't want to live in a perfect world. I've learned a lot from my mistakes. I don't want to live in a world where the reproduction of some people is more important than the reproduction of other people. So from where I sit, we're talking about this all wrong. It's not just about manipulating and controlling people's bodies. It's about who gets to be the holder of human history in the future. And I don't want that to just be one narrative or one experience or one existence. And that's the tie to reproductive justice, to also climate change and to making sure that the animals, the fauna, and the flora of the planet are not extinct either. We're supposed to be caretakers of this planet, right? So some people just don't take that seriously, and I do. So when I think about why reproductive health, reproductive rights, and reproductive justice all have to be the cornerstone, the touch piece of how we set our society up, it's not because I believe in some weird grand replacement theory or some white supremacist notion that, only some people should be alive in the future. It is more about if we are lucky enough to be living things and to share this planet with other species, then care and love should be a part of that. And I'm a nurse, right? I'm a healer. I'm a teacher. I'm a guide. And I take that very seriously. I took an oath to have a life of service. So I see the world very differently than I think a lot of people do, because reproduction in my mind represents potential, regardless of whatever is being created.
While the global maternal mortality rate has declined, the U.S. rate has increased. Why is that?
Well, first of all, I'm going to give a complicated answer to that because there's three parts to it. The reason the maternal health and morbidity mortality rates in the United States have increased while worldwide they have decreased. Number one, we got better at data collection. A lot of people don't understand that there are multiple ways to classify a pregnancy-related death. Let me give you listeners an example. If I am in a car and I get shot and I die and I'm pregnant, in some places that's considered a pregnancy-related death, even though it has nothing to do with the pregnancy. So we clean that up, right? Because how do you define a pregnancy-related death? If I fall down the stairs and I'm pregnant, is that a pregnancy-related death? Or are you just counting my death and my pregnancy, right? So we cleaned up a lot of that. Or the World Health Organization classified any deaths from a pregnant person out to a year, whereas in the United States, we were only counting up to 42 days after the birth. So data clarity showed that we were underestimating the number of pregnancy-related mortality in the United States. So we corrected that. We started correcting it in about 2016. The second reason why maternal deaths are increasing in the United States is because some people will want to blame their patients. I wrote a paper about this. Oh, the patients come to pregnancy older and sicker and fatter, and it's their fault. And I'm like, yeah, actually, no, that's really not the reason. The reason that we see Black women in the United States 3 to 4 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related complications and causes is because of structural racism. And when my students ask me, they're like, well, what do you mean? How does that show up? I said, well, first of all, we live in a country where the number one preventative health interventions that we can do is rate gate kept and rate limited by our capitalist system. A lot of people don't understand that health insurance is having health insurance is the number one intervention to improve health outcomes, because that gives you access to providers and it gives you access to care. And yet we tie our insurance to our employers. Well, it's not true in other countries where they've been able to reduce maternal morbidity and mortality. Right? They believe in this robust social safety net. So if you don't have access to insurance, at least in the United States, your health outcomes are going to be poor. The third reason, the other way that structural racism shows up is we have obstetric deserts. People can't even access an obstetrician. I mean, you're from Mississippi, right? 88% of counties don't have an obstetrician or a birth worker or birth care provider. I've been working with the midwives who have been trying to decriminalize midwifery in Mississippi and Alabama, right? The fact that the grand midwives were discredited when they were caring for people on plantations and doing a relatively good job. Not having access to midwifery care, not having access to doula care, that's a decision, right? Or when you go into a labor and delivery unit, if you're lucky enough to get into one, structural racism shows up when the nurses don't listen to you, because then they miss the signs and symptoms of deterioration when they could have acted earlier, or if they don't believe you, right? That's the Serena Williams telling Vogue in 2018 in January, telling her story, and then only to have Beyonce to turn around and tell her story in September around her toxemia pregnancy, or we call that preeclampsia. But if you don't believe people, again, you're going to miss signs and symptoms of deterioration. And by the time you want to do something, pregnancy is a time-limited situation. And it goes from emergent to urgent very rapidly. So if you're missing all those potential touch points where you could have done something, and we learn this information from our maternal morbidity and mortality reviews. So every maternal death, well, not every, because some states like Texas canceled their maternal morbidity and mortality reviews. We have a committee that goes back and looks at all the medical records, all the cases, all the visits, all the labs, everything, to figure out what happened and what could have prevented it. And those are called MMRCs, Maternal Morbidity and Mortality Review Committees. That's how we know that maternal deaths are preventable, or at least 80 to 90% of them are, because we can look in hindsight at all the different places, what was missed, all the different visits, all the different labs, all the different increases in blood pressure, all the signs and symptoms that could have saved that mom. But in real time, if you are afraid of Black people and don't like them, and yet you're charged with our care, and you're not listening to me, you're going to miss some. So in my mind, preventable maternal deaths would mean changes in nurse staffing ratios. It might mean changes in the racial, cultural concordance of the teams. It might mean having additional support. I think all pregnant people should have a doula, just because it is a reverent act. And so we as the village should provide them with all the honor and the care and the love that they need, not just because we want to prevent a harmful thing. So in my mind, we have over-medicalized pregnancy and childbirth. And for some people, there's too much intervention. I mean, the fact that the C-section, primary first-time C-section rate in Black women is as high as it is, when that's associated with known morbidity and known mortality, right? So in my mind, our rates are so high because we've decided that we don't want to keep pregnant people alive, or we only want to keep some pregnant people alive, because otherwise we would make different decisions.
Yeah. All right. So you kind of I think you've kind of answered my next two questions, but I'm going to ask them anyway. Could universal health care alleviate the problem?
It depends. So I actually advocate for a single payer in terms of if we're going to maintain insurance, right? I actually don't think we should have insurance and have capitalism at all. I think healthcare is a public good and it should be offered as such, and that people should have a living wage, whatever language you want to use to state that. That's what I believe in. So if by universal healthcare we mean people have universal access to a payer to be able to see a clinician, yes, I think that could really help. But again, if we don't change what the workforce looks like, because I mean, I say this all the time. When we did our Giving Voice to Mothers study, we saw that mistreatment was rampant in pregnancy-related care. We associated that. I didn't blame the clinicians. Our workplaces are inhumane. It don't work for the patients and it don't work for us. Right? Nobody should have to see 40, 50 patients a day in order to make ends meet. And it'd be spending 5 minutes with pregnant patients. That is inhumane. So in my mind, universal health care, if people had the time, the midwifery model of care where you can learn from each other and pregnant people, you could have your pregnancy related care in groups. Everybody always asks me, why do people like centering and group prenatal care? I said, well, number one, you're never alone with a racist ass, clinician. Number two, you're learning from other pregnant people, which is how, in my mind, we want to shepherd new humans into the world. And number three, there are more eyes on you than just that one clinician. So that if they miss something, maybe the medical assistant, maybe the nurse, maybe the team will catch something. We have to think about the model of care, just not the payer of it. So if that's what you mean by universal healthcare, sure. That's how I think about it.
Okay. So the next question, I have had as guests on this podcast a doula here in the Atlanta area and a candidate running for the Georgia House of Representatives discussing the importance of addressing the maternal mortality crisis in America and Georgia specifically.
Yep.
So I have two questions.
Yep.
How important are doulas and midwives in preventing maternal mortality? And can you give some public policy examples to decrease maternal mortality rates?
Absolutely. Well, number one, I don't think it's exclusively the responsibility of midwives and doulas to fix a problem they didn't create. So maternal morbidity and mortality is a nurse physician. It's a healthcare problem. That said, one of the reasons why they are so vital if we want to improve health outcomes is twofold. My good friend, Dr. Karen Scott, who wrote the Sacred Birth book and has created the only validated by Black women community patient-reported experience measure to improve obstetric racism, always says that doulas know how to move with people through time. Nurses and physicians and some midwives to a certain extent, we try to manage time during a birth. So there is a unspoken clock that a lot of people don't know that starts the minute your water breaks if you're a pregnant person. And that clock is dictated by infection risk. Fetuses live in aqueous environments. They live in water. So the minute that water breaks, we got to get a baby out so they can take their first breath and be able to live on air. So that clock is about 12 to 24 hours. And so a lot of decisions, a lot of interventions, so doulas know how to move with people through time to help the body do what it was designed to do. The rest of us on the team, we, for a long time, have been trying to manage time in pregnancy and birth. The midwifery model of care, so the second full piece to your answer, they have a unique perspective. Number one, they have very long appointments. Their intake appointments can be 2-3 hours. I know midwives that go to people's houses to assess what their social needs are, in addition to their clinical ones. I know midwives who, don't even have a phone service because their patients have their cell phone numbers. They can text them. I know midwives who provide care in groups it's a one-stop shop. The social workers are there. The psychologists are there. The nutritionists are there. When the people, they come in a group, they can bring their other kids. They can bring their partners. They do their own vital signs. They are able to dip their own urines, right? They're curating a pregnancy experience, not an appointment. So it's a different model of being able to honor people who are brave enough to propagate our species and to revere them as such. So the reason that doulas and midwives and don't get me wrong, we need obstetricians who can do C-sections because sometimes they're really necessary to save a baby in a mom's life. But that should not be the first line of how we do pregnancy-related care. I also want to be very clear with your listeners because I think this needs to be said as well. All pregnancies end. They all don't end in a birth. And I think we need to own that, right? All pregnancies end, but they all, and birth is not the only legitimate outcome of pregnancy. So we talk about the outcomes of pregnancy. We talk about miscarriage. We talk about abortion. We talk about infertility. We talk about birth. We talk about surrogate. Those are outcomes of pregnancy. We don't talk about pregnancy. So to answer your second question, right? I mean, we don't understand normal parturition or normal pregnancy, what initiates labor. We have theories around that. But we spend a lot of time studying abnormal. Maybe we should study normal. I say this all the time. People get in their feelings, but I would love for us to go into affluent environments where pregnancy outcomes are really good, right? I'm a professor at New York University. And in New York, Black women are 12 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related complications than everybody else. I would love to go into the wealthy, affluent areas and figure out what's the minimum constellation of things that you need to have in order to ensure those good outcomes. And then make sure everybody has those things. Because I bet you it will be clean water, clear night sky. I bet you it will be things like having a community center that has cooking classes and pottery and art and all these. It won't be any clinical thing. So for me, we don't take seriously enough. If people say they really have family values, and if that's true, pregnant people don't exist in environments. They don't exist in a bubble. My colleagues and I did a research study in the Central Valley in California, Fresno, where we get between 30 and 50 days where the temperature is over 100 degrees. Heat exposure is associated with prematurity. It makes sense, right? So if you are a farm worker, you don't get adequate hydration and you live in a place that doesn't have air conditioning. Heat exposure. I mean, we're all going to find this out in climate change. There are things that impact clinical outcomes that are not clinical. And we have to decide as a society, how much of that do we want to tolerate? Whether it's dirty, polluted water or dirty, polluted air. Pregnant people exist in that milieu. So in my mind, if we wanted to change policy, we would make sure that pregnant people, okay, here's another one. How many of your listeners know that regardless of how your pregnancy ends, if you don't go home with a baby, in most states, you got to go back to work because your disability don't kick in because you don't go home with a baby. So if your baby dies, you lose your disability. How many people know that? It's cruel. That's a simple policy change we could make. We decided that all NICUs, neonatal intensive care unit, like no parent would go bankrupt, that Medicaid would cover a NICU stay regardless of how long it is. We decided there's two groups in this country that have universal coverage. Children and the elderly under Medicare. That's if they don't gut it. We can make those decisions for other people. So as far as I'm concerned, the easiest policy decision, if we wanted to really do something about maternal mortality, there's one bill. Actually, it's 12. Lauren Underwood and Alma Adams and the Black Maternal Caucus and Black Mamas Matter Alliance introduced the Momnibus. That was 9 bills before COVID, and then it became 12. But if we wanted to do one thing, one policy change to reduce maternal mortality in the United States, we would extend all postpartum insurance, Medicaid, Obamacare, on exchange, employer-sponsored health insurance. We would extend that to a year because we know that 50 to 60% of maternal deaths happen in the postpartum period when people are not seeking care because their insurance runs out. So that'd be the one thing, extending. I wrote a piece about this in Scientific American, this open source, why we should extend postpartum Medicaid across the country. But we're not that serious about this. I mean, in 2027, in H.R. 1, which some people, sarcastically refer to as the big, beautiful bill, in 2027, we are looking at $800 million in cuts from the Medicaid program. Well, how many of your listeners know that almost over half the births in the United States are covered by Medicaid? So when I say that structural racism informs health outcomes in the United States, you are basically going to deprive half the births, and we have 4 million births in the United States every year. You're going to say that those people don't deserve coverage, which we know is the number one intervention to improve health outcomes for people. That's what that means. So the language of entitlement and all this, that's like not a thing. So extending postpartum healthcare coverage for people. I know moms who have C-sections that 8 days afterwards are driving for Lyft and Uber because they don't have health insurance. The last thing you should be doing after major abdominal surgery is sitting in a car driving for 8 hours. That's the kind of language we need to be using when we're trying to shape public policy about pregnancy-related care and healthcare, and not buy into the false binary of entitlement programs or other things that are just not true. That's how I think about it.
All right. So I got a couple more questions. How much of a challenge is it for you to do your healthcare advocacy with the current leadership of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services?
I have dealt with active and credible death threats because I've only worked in reproductive health rights and justice my entire career. I have had to deal with active and credible death threats since 2010. We need to raise better humans. That said, I also help to support many of the law firms around the country who are suing the administration. And I'm very lucky that the Washington State Nurses Association, along with Academy Health and a whole lot of other professional organizations that I belong to, were willing to sue, summarize science, and be able to provide amicus briefs in many of the cases. I have been doing advocacy work my entire career. We were able to restore the 49 disappeared federal databases, many of which are pregnancy related, right? PRAMS, the Pregnancy Risk Assessment Monitoring Surveillance Survey, BRIFIS, the Behavioral Risk Factor Survey. These are surveys that the taxpayers and Congress have fielded for over 50 years. Data that we collect that go to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention so we can design interventions based on those data. Of course, we were going to sue to get those databases back. So my life has been disrupted by the current Department of Health and Human Services because not only do I have to do my job as a full tenured professor and provide teaching for 300 undergrads every semester and all the service work that I do, I also have to do my full-time job of suing the administration, being deposed, writing up expert witness testimony, and being able to get data for my PhD students. I have 29 MPH, master's prepared people working on masters in public health and or PhD students around the country who are expecting to use those databases to complete their degrees. I have one student, 5-7 years of work, and they can't get the most recent data because the Doge disappeared those databases. So yeah, I've been doing 2 full-time jobs since January 20th of last year. So it's been very difficult for me to do my work. Also in the context of having to deal with active and credible death threats because I believe in reproductive justice. And I think it's very, very important that we not lose sight of the fact that regardless of why people are seeking care, they deserve very good care. So it's been very difficult for me to do my work, and I'm doing it anyway. I come from a long line of badass Black people. Father's a Superior Court judge. Started the Black Law Student Association at Pitt with his classmates. I'm good.
All right. A year ago, you said DEI is the easy thing to blame everything on. Number one, you don't have to define it. Number two, it's a buzzword that means different things to different people. And 3, some people don't want to do that work. So it's an easy scapegoat. How can institutions of higher learning, especially those with medical schools, avoid, as you put it, cowardly acquiescence?
Yeah, I said that. I say it again. In fact, I said this to some students yesterday because the Super Bowl is Sunday. If every academic medical center with a Pac-12 football team decided last year that they were not going to be able to field any games, no Friday night lights for y'all, because we can't function as a sports entity without our sports medicine and academic medicine colleagues, we would be having a whole different conversation right now. But we don't have any collective solidarity amongst our institutions. You got some people that want to fly under the radar. You got some people that's going to go along to get along. If every university, academic medical center, that's the reason we haven't heard from the American Hospital Association or the American Medical Association. I'm in a situation right now where my entire discipline might be deprofessionalized by the Department of Education. The open comment period around that goes until March 2nd. Social work, nursing, public health, there's 13 health professions that's on the list to be deprofessionalized by the Department of Education, meaning that they will cap our capacity to have student loans at $25,000, which will mean the nursing shortage will be exacerbated and or only rich people can become nurses. So would I say that people are being cowardly again? Yes, absolutely. I don't even use the acronym DE&I. I make people say the words. I make people clarify, what do you mean when you say diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, belonging? What do you mean when you say that? Because clearly, right, DEI became a buzzword like woke, and it means different things to different people. And I was like, I need you to tell me what your action is going to be that's associated with executive orders and compliance. I have people who I went to events sponsored by offices of DE&I that I can't prove that they were there because people took down websites. They closed offices. Luckily, I'm an obsessive scientist and I download PDFs for every invite I get. I YouTube everything. And I ask the press to be at my events when people are like, oh, Dr. McLemore, can we record this? Hell yeah. You got people who can't even prove their entire career happened because the website upon which their work lived no longer exists. So as far as I'm concerned, I try to use my platform to remind people that there are things that we can do to combat misinformation and disinformation, and particularly around our efforts to diversify the workforce, to include as many people as possible, and to really get to a point where perspectives matter. And so I knew people who were working on reparations, calling that DE&I work. I knew people who are working on retrofitting structures and calling that DE&I work. I had affinity groups and a whole variety of activities that, in my mind, a just society should be doing. But when you put something under an umbrella, it makes it easily neutralized and targeted. And a lot of people did not take Kimberly Crenshaw seriously when she did a whole redux at the Congressional Black Caucus annual legislative meeting on Project 2025. We knew this was coming. And as somebody who works in reproductive health, rights, and justice, they practice all of these activities on us. And the rest of healthcare stood by and watched. If you go back in timeline, anti-abortion rhetoric, when you go back in timeline, everything that's happening right now was practiced on those of us who work in abortion, family planning, and contraception. That's why repro is grounded in everything that's happening right now. The intimidation tactics, the arm twisting of our institutions, the discrediting, the misinformation, the disinformation, getting people to buy into false binaries, that was all practiced on repro. And that's been a 40-year plan. So when I think about the collective solidarity that's needed to get out of all of this, people are not learning the right lesson from what we're dealing with, which is why I stay so busy trying to get people to understand that. So yeah, I said those words a year ago. I'd say them again now. And actually, I would probably say even more strong language in hindsight, because being a coward in the now makes you irrelevant in the future. And therefore, your opinion doesn't matter, and I'm not listening to you.
Yeah. Well, I normally close out the interviews with a question. This year I've been doing it, but you already, thanks to the 20 question segment, you already answered that question. So I'm going to flip it a little bit. And I want you to tell the listeners why they should have hope.
It is out, regardless of whatever spiritual, existential, philosophical orientation you have to life. Most human beings want a dignified life and a dignified death. And so in order to have that be true, in order to have meaningful work, in order to have purposive existence, you don't live on an island by yourself. So the hope is that collectively, I think we can create the kind of world that we want to live in. It's going to be very difficult to do because there's some hard truths that we need to confront. So we should have hope because there's always been justice and joy in the midst of tragedy, even during enslavement, right? There has always been justice and joy and art and pleasure and things worth fighting for. So in my view, this is temporary. And so how are we going to put fundamentally things in place to make sure that future versions of ourselves will be proud, but also dignified in where we find ourselves? That's the question I ask myself every morning when I'm at the gym. I spend a lot of time thinking about what action can I do now that will unburden some people. I mean, I'm lucky. I'm a teacher. I work with undergrads. I work with graduate students. I work with our future brain trust. What do they need to hear from me in this moment that will allow them to bring their gifts and talents forward to help us think very differently about how to restructure our society? And how can I help them to do that work?
Yeah. So, Dr. Monica McLemore, I really, really am honored that you came on. And if people want to reach out to you, how can they do that?
Yeah. So I'm myself on all social media platforms except for Twitter because I left after I got a month of death threats because I wrote a piece on E.O. Wilson for Scientific American. My handle is McLemore, M-R, and that's on Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, LinkedIn. I left TikTok because I don't really like their new surveillance situation and their new terms and conditions. So I left there because I can't be bothered. But I'm myself everywhere. I also am a professor at New York University. I have a web page there where I can be contacted. And I very much appreciate, podcasters and people like you who allow for us to be able to talk directly to the public and the people that we serve, to be able to remind folks that this does not have to be like this. We can all make a different decision to change our future. And I hope people decide to do that.
Yeah, well, I was trying to come up with a title for this episode. And so my previous guest kind of laid it out there for me, and you have solidified that. And that was to have the fight. In order for us to see the changes we need, we've got to fight for them. And it is clear to me after talking to you that you are a warrior of exemplary courage and dignity. And so again, it's been an honor to have you on.
Well, I'm grateful that you let me have this conversation. And I'm grateful for you and your listeners. And I'm grateful for people who are unapologetically willing to reject the hatefulness of this current moment and the false binary that we all have to be separated in the future. Because that's a lie. And as long as I'm alive, that's not going to be a thing. So that's how I think about it.
All right, guys. On that note, we're going to catch y'all on the other side. All right. And we are back. So I want to thank Kelly Cervantes and Dr. Monica McLemore for coming on the podcast. Kelly's book is called The Luckiest. Please get that. It's been out for a minute, but it is really, really powerful. And you can tell even in the interview that she really put her heart into it. And I think it's a book that all of us can relate to in dealing with triumphs and tragedies in our lives and how they juxtaposition each other, right? At one moment, you could be having the greatest moment in your life and then bam, tragedy hits, or vice versa, right? And, Kelly really captures, telling her story, some feelings that a lot of us may have experienced. And it's very encouraging to press forward and understanding that that's how our life is going to go. Somebody posted on an interesting statistic, said that the fact that we are here is that we have defied odds. And what she meant was that there was a 1 in 4 trillion chance that we would be born. 1 in 4 trillion, right? So that's like 80.25% chance, right? I'm not good at math, but something like that we would even be born. And the point of her bringing that out was that we should look at life as a blessing as whole, because the fact that we exist, no matter how long we live, just the fact that we exist is a miracle in itself. And it's something that should be celebrated, right? So I think Kelly conveys that very well. There was a commercial I saw that said something about we should measure our years on earth by our life. It's something to the effect that we should measure the years that we're on earth by the life that we live, right? And then there's the old classic thing that you hear at a lot of funerals, especially Black funerals, where on a tombstone, it'll have the year that you were born, and then they have the year that you died. And then in between, there's a dash. And the challenge is, what did you do in the dash? Right? So go get that book, The Luckiest. And then Dr. Monica McLemore, what a joy it was to talk to that sister. The power and the confidence in fighting for what she believes in is amazing. And she's dealing with stuff. We didn't get into that in the interview. We kind of talked beforehand. But she's dealing with the same things that a lot of us are dealing with at a certain age. And, you know, some of the things she did mention in the interview was about doing the work that she's been doing. She's been getting death threats for the last 16 years. Can you imagine getting death threats for the last 16 years just doing what you do for a living? Speaking out on things that you believe in, right? Doesn't seem to have deterred her in any way, shape, or form, which is the whole point of having the fight, right? And I got that theme from Kelly's book, but it applies to everything that we're dealing with, right? Especially during this time in our lives as Americans, the 250th year of our existence. Having the fight is more important than ever. And so I don't know how long I'm going to talk today, but I do want to read something. And this was mentioned during Dr. McLemore's interview, but, you know, we just kind of glossed over that because she was trying to paint a big picture of where we were. But this lady named Claire Cook Collin, she is the executive director of a nonprofit in Missouri called Progress Missouri. And she wrote an editorial column. And so when y'all listen to this, you know, it'll be out of the news cycle and all that. But I wanted to have a permanent record. She wrote this in the Kansas City Star. And I think it encapsulates a lot of what normal human beings should feel, normal Americans should feel at this particular point. Like I said, by the time that this airs, it'll be, 72 hours old or whatever. But, it is something that I think that we should be cognizant of. So let me see if I can do this without dealing with some other technical stuff. Y'all just hold on for a second. All right, let's see if I can do it now. All right, so she said, in the first week of Black History Month, the President of the United States chose to amplify a post that inserted an apparently AI-generated video depicting Barack Obama and Michelle Obama as apes. Let's call this what it is. It isn't edgy. It isn't political humor. And as White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt confirmed, it wasn't an accident. It's racism. Blatant, dehumanizing textbook racism coming from the highest office in the country. While most Americans had no trouble recognizing that, every Republican member of Missouri's congressional delegation has had trouble saying a single word about it so far. Missouri Representative Emanuel Cleaver immediately condemned the post as vile and urged Americans to refuse to be the worst version of themselves. His Republican colleagues, silent as of this writing. Let's be honest about what that means. Silence from elected officials isn't neutrality. It's a decision. And there are only two explanations. They either agree with it or they're too cowardly to speak. Neither one is leadership. This shouldn't be complicated. You shouldn't need a communication strategy or a pollster to decide whether comparing Black Americans to animals is wrong. You shouldn't need party permission to say racism is racism. In fact, other Republicans in the Senate are saying it out loud. Tim Scott, the only Black Republican in the U.S. Senate, called this the most racist thing he has seen come out of the White House. If he can say it plainly, what exactly is stopping Missouri's delegation? What's stopping Josh Hawley? What's stopping Eric Schmidt? These are politicians who rarely miss a chance to get on camera. They issue statements about everything. They can fire off outraged tweets in seconds. But when the president spreads racist propaganda about the Obamas, suddenly they have nothing to say. That is not restraint. That's cowardice. Or worse, complicity. Because silence from people in power sends a message. It tells Black Missourians that their dignity isn't worth defending. It tells kids watching that this behavior is normal. It tells the country that Missouri's leaders will tolerate anything, as long as it keeps them in good standing with their party. Public service is supposed to require a spine. If our elected officials can't muster the basic moral clarity to condemn open racism, what exactly are they fighting for on our behalf? You don't have to be a Democrat to draw this line. You just have to have a conscience. Missourians deserve leaders who will say this is wrong without checking first to see how it polls. Right now, too many of our representatives look less like leaders and more like careerists. People so focused on protecting their jobs that they'll swallow their alleged values to do it. History is very clear about how this plays out. It rarely judges the loud racists kindly, and it judges the people who stayed silent right alongside them. This moment shouldn't be hard. Condemn the racism. Say it's unacceptable. The fact that Missouri Republicans can't even do that tells us everything we need to know, right? So that was Claire Cook Collin, and she is the executive director of the nonprofit Progress Missouri. So basically what she said, you can interchange Missouri for Mississippi. You can change Missouri to Georgia. You can change Missouri to any other state that has Republican members of Congress, Louisiana, Alabama, Florida, just flip it around. Just insert here, right? Now, there have been reports that some members did not go public with their criticism, but they literally called the White House. And the spin from that was, after they finally deleted it, I think it took them several hours to finally take it down, that a staffer did it, right? It's, in the game of Clue, the big joke is the butler did it, right? In Washington, when something goes down, the staffer did it. That's usually how that works, right? And, but the time of day that it was released, the indication that the staffer was the president himself, right? Because the president has been known to stay up all night, get on his true social platform and message away, right? So it is what it is. And this is not the first time that this administration, this individual has disrespected Black people in February. It's almost like this is what he does. And I guess there is a base that he appeals to by doing that. I just, I've gotten to the point now, and I get that there are people who identify as Republican who believes in principles of the Republican Party pre-Trump, and they So when he does things or they support people other than him, they feel justified in that because they have those core beliefs. And, we as Democrats, when Democrats grew up, we deal with the individual that screws up, but we still stay loyal to the party. So I get that. But the difference is if this was a Democrat in this day and age, because there were a time where the Democrats were just as racist, if not more so, right? Woodrow Wilson was a Democrat and he had the Birth of the Nation show. You thought Melania was something. He had the Birth of the Nation premiere at the White House. He filmed, he watched the film. And for those of y'all who don't know, of a certain time, The Birth of the Nation was the movie that basically made the Ku Klux Klan like heroes, American heroes, right? It was taken from a book called The Klansman, right? And so, so I get it. If this was happening now in our lifetime, we probably would have ran Woodrow Wilson out of office. He wouldn't have got a second term, at least not on the Democratic ticket, But, so and then the other thing is I'm not really surprised about it, but, the point I'm trying to make with these folks, it's like, but just don't try to defend it to me, right? Either you condemn it or you don't. And if you don't condemn it, then that tells me what side you're on. And we'll deal with that. While you're in office, we'll still try to work around you or even try to convince you for certain issues to vote for, whether that's in Congress or the state legislature where you live, whatever. But come election time, we're going to vote you out. So just understand that that's part of the deal. When you decide that you don't want black people or you don't respect black people, then black people are going to vote that way. And people still say, well, why do black people just constantly vote for the Democrats? Because apparently the Democrats haven't been as stupid as to be totally disrespectful. There are black people that have been elected as Democrats, right? And I've had people on the show that have made the argument that we shouldn't, doesn't matter if they're Republican, independent, whatever, political scientists, or, we shouldn't just vote for Democrats. But if the Democratic Party is the only party that gives a damn about us, or at least acts like they do, what choice do we have? Right? Because the Republican Party, even though there are Republicans elected in the Republican Party at a federal level, those representatives brag on the fact that they represent districts that aren't majority black. So they don't carry an agenda that helps black people. They carry an agenda that helps Donald Trump and the Republicans. Now, they'll try to make the argument that it will help black people, but even Tim Scott said, yeah, not so much. He's not switching parties, but at least his reflexes kicked in and said, that's racist. Stop that. Right? And if Byron Donalds or Wesley Hunt or I guess that brother out of California or whoever, Brother Jones out of Michigan, whatever, if y'all just said that's racist, okay, at least we know the reflexes are still there. Byron Donalds won't say that because he wants to be governor of Florida. And he thinks that'll turn off the Republicans, which is an indictment about the base that he's trying to court. And him, but, that's the game of politics. You're trying to build support. So if you say anything that alienates that support, well, that diminishes your chances of winning. Now, what that means down the road, what that means in the afterlife, whole different discussion. But in his mindset, now Byron might have been one of the ones to call. They didn't say which Republicans called. They wouldn't reveal those names. Maybe he was one of the ones to call. He definitely has the right to, considering how much he put himself out there to get the president reelected. Wesley Hunt could make that call. But Wesley Hunt said he didn't have a problem sleeping in the Robert E. Lee barracks because he said, I'm at West Point, what I'm going to do? All the freshmen have to stay there. But, now that you're a member of Congress and you're an alumnus of West Point, you could probably say, change the name. Of course, now with, the sentimental historical value that P. Hexstaff has toward these people, he would not honor it, I guess. Or maybe they couldn't find another person named Lee that went to West Point and did well and they could rename it for and just still keep it as the Lee Barracks. I don't know. That's what he did with Fort Bragg. So, I noticed that a lot of folks that I interacted with in Mississippi, former colleagues of mine who have been really getting on Facebook or anything else, trying to defend this current age of republicanism. And, one went as far as to say a tone doesn't symbolize fascism. And, they trying to defend people getting shot in the face or shot in the back of the head in Minnesota, right? And then when they come at me, it's like, well, Erik, you don't know what you're talking about. I was like, so you went to the law enforcement academy at some time in your life? Because I did. Have you filled out a use of force report? I have. So what are we talking about? All right. But even off of that minutia, it's like just the whole concept that they want to make our argument against this administration more about our emotions. And I guess that's because their politics is based on emotion. There are people in this country that feel as though that they are being ignored or being neglected. Their feelings are hurt. And most of them have less melanin in their skin than I do. They have more recessive biological genes than I do. And so they think because America is becoming a country where African Americans and Latino Americans and Asian Americans are becoming the majority collectively, that they're feeling some kind of way. And the reality is that all people want to do is live their life and not be restricted because of their ethnic background or their physical features. They want to be given the same opportunity to go to school, to go to church, to get a job, to live in a crime-free neighborhood. Those are just basic things that we want. We want to be able to go to the grocery store and be able to afford the groceries that we need. We want to be able to buy a house, be able to afford the house mortgage, right? Or a car even. Some of us would like to take vacations. You shouldn't have to wait till you're old and gray like me to decide, I might want to use this passport that I got. Life is tricky that way. But, and some people can do that. But the hustle that they have to do in order to achieve the lifestyle they want, it doesn't make any sense. That people have to have 2 or 3 jobs just to live a lifestyle that they want to live or to take care of basic necessities that they need. Erik, what does that have to do with racism? Everything. Because most of these folks, especially black folks, are the ones that having to do all this hustling, all this work. I wrote a terrible, terrible blog. It was probably the worst blog I ever wrote. And it was about hustling hard, right? And, it was kind of like trying to encourage people to do what they need to do. And at the same time, like critiquing the fact that we have to do that. But it was, when I looked at it after I put it out there, I said, this is awful. But it was a song I heard and it kind of prompted me to write it. But I guess it was terrible in the sense that I really didn't know what I wanted to say. Because on the one hand, you want people to do what they need to do. But as somebody that's been in public service, it's hard for me to see people going from one job to the next and barely having time for their family, barely having time for themselves, just to make ends meet. But, you know, people that defend the president, either verbally or silently, think that's okay for y'all, right? They think that's okay for us as especially Black people to do that. Now they'll turn around and call us lazy on the flip side, right? They'll call Latinos lazy and that's the other thing, the Latinos are lazy, but they're taking our jobs. So, you know, when you have to navigate through all this hypocrisy, you have to navigate through all of these feelings that these people have. It makes it really, really unbearable for the rest of us to try to exist. Because everything they're doing is based off of their feelings and their pent up anger. They're mad because Billie Eilish said at an award show a historical fact. She expressed it in an opinion saying that nobody is illegal on stolen land, which is something that Native Americans have been saying forever, right? But there's nobody Native American that's in this administration. There's never been a Native American elected president of the United States. So you've never heard that on a national front. But if you have friends who are Native American, or if you follow people like Billie Eilish, you will hear that. And then some goofball, I don't even know if he's from the United States, showed up at her house. And, you know, I've heard some people say her house is worth $12 million or whatever. If you've paid attention to this young woman, first of all, she lives with her brother. And I think the rest of her family too. I don't know. I remember something at one point, all of her family was living together. And I think her and her brother finally got their own place. And all they do is just produce music, which is why she's one of the best out there. If you're into that kind of music she's in, she's one of the best to ever do it. And she's young. I mean, I don't think she's even 30. And by the time her career is over, she'll probably have won more awards than any other artist in the history of the business. That's how good she is. And she's dedicated her life to doing that. But she's not naive to what's going on in the world. And if James Woods, the guy who played Byron De La Beckwith in The Ghost of Mississippi, can have an opinion, then why can't she? Because based on what James Woods says and what Billie Eilish says, she's more informed. So I want to inform people. It doesn't matter if they are musicians or actors or athletes or bus drivers, right? I don't care what profession you're in. If you have an informed opinion, let's hear it. Kind of that First Amendment thing, right? Yeah. So, but this guy shows up at her house and, you know, and he quotes it at $3 million. That sounds more accurate than what Jesse Waters or anybody else on Fox says. Because they're saying her house is like worth $12 million or whatever the case may be. What I know about this young lady, if her house was worth $12 million at this point, she'd probably sell it. Just easy money. If it went from 3 to 12, let's make that happen. Then she'll find another $2-3 million crib to crash it with her brother. But this guy shows up at her house and then he knocks on the door and, you know, which considering that she's a celebrity, that was a pretty impressive feat. You got that close to knock on the door, right? And, you know, and then it's just kind of like, well, you know, if this is stolen land, then why does she have a $3 million house? So you want her to be homeless on historically stolen land for your feelings. You know, when you get caught up in your feelings, you lose logic. And that's why 1 minute you're saying everybody has a right to carry a gun. And then the next day you're saying, well, You can't carry a gun if you protest ICE or the police, or if you protest anything that we believe in. You can't carry a gun, right? Need I remind you that the NRA pushed for gun control in the 1960s, late 1960s, early 1970s in California, because the Black Panthers were walking around with guns to protect people from police brutality, Black people. That's why California was the first state to have gun control. And it was a Republican named Ronald Reagan that pushed it. And the NRA supported it, right? Because, the Republicans always like to twist the history and say, oh, well, the Democrats were, they were the slave owners, which is true. But what is also true is that the Republicans in California and the NRA got the first gun control passed in the United States in California because of the Black Panthers. So the hypocrisy has always been out there, always, especially with this particular group of people. And over these 60 years plus, they've switched parties, because all those people that the Republicans talk about being slave owners, their descendants, and those who wanted the South to rise again, they switched parties and became, the Republicans. And this was all in my lifetime, right? 1968. So, so we've been dealing with the hypocrisy for a long time. So none of this is new. The racism, the hypocrisy, the lies, we've been dealing with that. It just seems as though now, because we have all of this media, we're just more exposed to it, whether it's on the internet, on your phone, social media feeds, or, on your television. We got access to it all the time. And we've got more people feeling emboldened to express that, right? Because, depicting the Obamas as apes is nothing new. I mean, they've accused Michelle Obama of being trans, right? Which offends a lot of trans people, by the way. Just so you understand, that terrible. They hold Michelle Obama up as a female icon. And, that's totally disrespectful to their community as well as the Obamas, right? And that's the way you intended that to be. But, they've said terrible things about, a man built his political careers, and his wife, the one that's got the movie out. They built their political career saying that Obama wasn't even a citizen. The audacity of somebody who is an immigrant to try to talk about somebody else's birthright who illegally got here, right? An Einstein visa, Elon Musk, undocumented immigrant, right? See, all these people that are trying to say all these bad things, because they're the classic human beings that once they get in the door, they shut it. Once they get on the other side of the gate, they close the gate and become the gatekeeper and say, you can't come in. They made it. They maneuvered their way through the system and got in, but don't let a Latino do it. Don't let a Black Nigerian do it. Don't let anybody from Haiti in at all, right? So this is all nothing new. And like I said, by the time you hear this, it'll be out of the main news cycle. But just because it's out of the news cycle doesn't mean that it's not still being dealt with, right? They just sentenced the guy to life that tried to take out President Trump at the golf course. I don't even think they, still trying to figure out the Pennsylvania thing, but they just sentenced that guy to life. Things are going on. The Mangione case, a young man who's accused of killing the health insurance executive, he's going through his legal proceedings, right? Don Lemon and Georgia Ford and Nikema Armstrong and her friends, Chantel, I believe, and one other guy, Ted, I believe, they're still have to deal with their court case. The congresswoman from New Jersey is still dealing with her court case, right? The Justice Department is still trying to put Letitia James in jail. None of this stuff has stopped just because the news is not covering it. These people are having to fight to challenge these things. So, what we have to be disciplined in is, even though it's not coming up on your news screen every day, your news feed, doesn't mean it's not happening. We have to be disciplined to remember. We have to be disciplined never to forget. And we have to be disciplined to hold these people accountable. Those voting records in Georgia have not come back. Despite the motions and whatever the judge says and all, they still haven't given those records back to the state of Georgia, primarily Fulton County. We still don't know if all of the documents that were stolen at Mar-a-Lago were ever returned. We know a majority of them were because the FBI went and got them. But did they get all of them? See, all of this stuff, man. And he bombards you with all of this stuff deliberately. That's what Steve Bannon told him. That's what Ray Cohen told him, Cohen and all these other folks. Just bombard him with Roger Stone, all these people. This is part of the strategy, just to hit you with all this stuff. Our job is to remember and to hold them accountable, whether that's personal boycotts on products, whether it's voting, writing letters to your members of Congress, to your state legislators. Gotta hold these people accountable. Can't forget what they're doing. If you want to protest, protest. But just remember who these people are and vote and act accordingly. All right, that's all I got. Thank y'all for listening. Until next time.
NBG Podcast Network.